Can I start? Yes. Okay, great. Welcome everybody to this very interesting event on trade and indigenous people. This event is part of a series looking at this question of indigenous people in OECD countries. Actually, we have 40 million indigenous people living in 14 OECD countries. So this is a very important topic for the OECD. I am the director of the OECD Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities, serving different committees. We are working on this issue from the angle of regional development, local development, and also on entrepreneurship. But this is such an important issue that some ambassadors, and here we have today we have a director because this is the subject of today. So I was saying that we have been working on this issue for a couple of years now. We have produced a number of reports on this subject from the angle of regional development, looking at this question of gaps in well-being, where the indigenous population are locating within countries. And we saw that they are especially concentrated in some neighborhood in large cities, but also mainly in rural areas, in some communities. And we have been able to measure the gaps in well-being outcome and making comparison with non-indigenous people. And actually we find very striking figures. We have been focusing also on the question of land tenure. We have been focusing on the question of governance. But the point that I wanted to make is in the way we have been working with these countries, because we have been covering 4 countries so far, and we also engage with many others. The way we have been working is that we were not drafting a report on our own. We have been taking a place-based approach, a bottom-up approach, engaging from the start with indigenous leaders. And actually we have been working with 600 networks of indigenous leaders. So it's something that is really at the core of the methodology that we have been conducting so far. So today we have a very interesting agenda. We will first hear from 2 ambassadors, from 1 ambassador, and the other one is going to close the event. They are the host of this event, Ambassador Barclay from New Zealand and Ambassador Pearson from Australia, 2 countries that are not so far one from the other. They have been doing a lot of things together, and they are actually hosting and organizing this specific event. But we will hear also from Ambassador of Canada today and Ambassador of Colombia. So we are very happy to have you, ambassadors. But we will start first with opening remarks, and then we will have a round of intervention from 3 indigenous leaders that we have invited from Australia and Canada, and then we will have a closing remark. So now, without further ado, I'm going to ask Ambassador Berkeley to make the opening remarks. And please, I would like to ask everybody to remind that it's very important to put the button off when we finish to speak, because there are a lot of echoes. So please, Ambassador.
Thanks very much, Lamia, and good morning, everyone. First, I'd like to greet you in the Indigenous language of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. And I'm very grateful and pleased to be here as one of your hosts on this panel discussion on Indigenous trade. As you all know, Indigenous people have a long, proud and resilient history as traders and entrepreneurs in various sectors of the economy. And while Aotearoa and Australia are co-hosting this event, We also see this as an extremely important opportunity to bring Indigenous voices to the OECD on a subject that we feel that Indigenous exporters and entrepreneurs have a lot to share. So I'm looking forward to hearing from the panelists, sharing their experiences and talking about how they see the future for Indigenous trade. And I think panelists listening to your unique perspectives and experience will give the participants and listeners a chance to learn about the different opportunities for cooperation between governments and Indigenous trade actors. So what we know is that firms engaged in the tradable and export-focused sectors are more innovative, they're more competitive, they pay higher wages. And we know that at least in my country, Indigenous people are increasingly active in these sectors. But at the same time, we also know that inequality has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and that Indigenous peoples face continued social and economic challenges. Aotearoa, during our APEC hosting year, we worked alongside APEC economies, also with input from Indigenous people to develop the Indigenous Peoples Economic and Trade Cooperation Agreement, EPETCA. So this is a new, first of its kind, open plurilateral arrangement across several economies, including Australia and Canada, members now, which is great to see. And the idea is that it creates a framework to work together with member economies of APEC to increase trade and economic cooperation. And I do commend this arrangement to the participants to have a look at. I'm very privileged to be able to welcome our speakers for this session. So I know over in our part of the world, it's getting quite late, but I'd like to say special greetings, Tracy, tēnā koe, Ahoa, Nikora, tēnā koe, and greetings to you, Sean. And thank you everyone that's joined us in the room today, the ambassadors of Colombia and Canada, as well as my co-host from Australia, friends from the OECD Secretariat, and those of you online. So I'd like to finish just with the whakatauki, which is a Māori proverb, nā te roro, naka te roro, ka ora te manuhiri, which means with your food basket and my food basket, the people will thrive. So I think that's the idea of this meeting, the OECD, member governments and Indigenous traders working together to contribute to thriving communities. Thank you very much, Lamia.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. We're going to hear now from my colleague, the Director of the Trade and Agriculture Directorate in the OECD. Marion, Indigenous people have a long history of trade and entrepreneurs. They are owning a lot of small businesses. We're looking at that in our work. But of course, they are facing specific challenges. I know in trade you have this inclusive trade agenda. We want to hear from you, Marion, about what is your perspective and how we can really help advance this agenda on Indigenous people and how they can thrive on international trade.
Thank you, Lamia, and very many thanks for having us here, having Tati, having me here. I am, as you heard, the director of the Trade and Agriculture Directorate, and I repeat this because I will also be making reference to agriculture, where the theme of Indigenous people came up notably in last week's ministerial meeting of agriculture ministers. I'm very pleased to be here and also very pleased to have the opportunity to listen to Ambassador Caroline Wilkie of New Zealand. Caroline, with this arrangement, the Indigenous Peoples Economic and Trade Arrangement, New Zealand has once again shown what an innovator you are when it comes to international trade law. And if there was to be a Nobel Prize for innovation in international economic law, I really think that that prize should go to New Zealand. You have been a partner of crime with Canada and at least one other one. And here you're teaming up with Australia. Now I'm really thinking here of the combination of EPETCA, DIPA, the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, and GITAGA, the Global Trade and Gender Arrangement. Very innovative legal arrangements that I think will very much influence what will happen in trade in the coming decades. Now, I finished with the gender, the reference to GTAGA, the Global Trade and Gender Agreement, because the theme Indigenous people, trade and Indigenous people indeed falls at in my directorate under the area trade and inclusiveness. And there we also find trade and youth, trade and women, trade and Indigenous people. And I wanted to structure my remarks around what are the similarities between these groups when it comes to trade and what are the differences. And I would like to make 4 points. When it comes to similarities, we find the areas of access to finance. That's the first one. The second one, it matters where you are working, in which sector, on how you're affected by trade. But differences in area of trade is the local versus global tension, where being indigenous has often a local, a geographic connotation, and that's something we find in agriculture rather than in trade. And the fourth point is the role of traditional knowledge, intellectual property rights. That's a theme very specific to the theme trade and Indigenous people. Let me go to the theme access to finance. This is a theme that runs across the trade and inclusiveness agenda, where we find that a marginalized group have this one thing in common, that they find it harder to access finance than other groups. That's a typical challenge women face. And we also find that in many countries for Indigenous communities, no access to finance or limited access to finance means limited possibilities to invest, so limited possibilities to explore growth opportunities that open markets may offer you. So this is a very important limiting factor when it comes to being integrated in open markets and being able to trade. The second point that we systematically look at when we look at how does trade or how do open markets affect particular groups in the population is we look at where do people work. Do they rather work in export-oriented sectors, import-oriented sectors, or in sectors that are not very much exposed to international trade? And here we had the opportunity last year to work in New Zealand on a study on trade and gender. And there we did have the opportunity to look in particular also at Maori and Pacifica women. I hope I pronounced that well. And we found there's something interesting in the sense that we find that women in general in New Zealand, like in other countries, are less part of of trading activities. But within the group of women, we found that Maori and Pacifica women are more involved. And in particular, they are more involved in export-oriented sectors. So there is a difference there. With Indigenous women versus other women, and within this particular group, and the same thing was the case for men, relatively more involved in relatively export-oriented sectors. That's partly because of the involvement in agriculture, and that's such an important sector for New Zealand exports. But this was a first study, a first way of looking at the data, but it shows one way in which we will assess this, address this challenge. It's always important to look at who is active in what. And we had a first exposure when working on this study on women and trade in New Zealand. So I mentioned access to finance, looking at where do Indigenous people work, in which sectors are they active. And then I wanted to mention, as I said, 2 points that are very specific about the Indigenous trade and Indigenous theme as we have been looking at it so far. I mentioned the point local versus global. We see that tension very much in the agricultural discussion. And as I mentioned, we had last week, we held a ministerial meeting, and in the declaration that was agreed there, the declaration contains language that acknowledges that says we should acknowledge and promote the importance of Indigenous and traditional knowledge. So that's my first point, the reference to knowledge. What is important one of the things that plays out in the agricultural sector is that producing agricultural goods is so much linked to your soil, is so much linked to your territory, is so much linked to very local variables. And this is something that is very important in the discussion of when it comes to agricultural trade. On the one hand, traders are exposed to global markets. On the other hand, what they do is so much linked to a local perspective. And I think this is something that also plays out in the discussion around trade and indigenous people and the role of indigenous people in trade. So for instance, we know from agricultural trade a concept called geographical indications. Champagne has to be produced in the Champagne region. And we see a similar aspect evolving around trade and indigenous people, where sometimes now we get products being labeled made by indigenous people. And unfortunately, that's not necessarily the case. I have myself bought Ambassador Jeanette in Canada, a beautiful bottle made by indigenous people. And it was one of these things designed and produced in China, and just having a nice label on it. And I discovered after watching a documentary about these things on TV. So, but this idea of particular legislation around belonging to something, to a particular group of the population or to a particular region, that's something we know from agriculture, maybe something that will start playing a role in the discussion on trade and indigenous people. And then last but not least, this very specific and important aspect of traditional knowledge. Frankly speaking, when I speak to indigenous leaders about agriculture, I have the impression that they are speaking about exactly the same discussion we are having when we discuss sustainability in agriculture, environmental sustainability, but with totally different terminology, and terminology that is more beautiful, more poetic, and yes, indeed, more traditional. I think when we talk about traditional knowledge, we may be in certain areas of our work in a situation where we start to reinvent the wheel, a wheel that is still very much actively being used by indigenous people, definitely in the field of agriculture, and we can only learn from listening to them. There is a bigger aspect of to which extent should knowledge, intellectual property coming from indigenous communities be protected in this particular way, and to which extent should intellectual property rights be linked to the indigenous terminology, or to which extent has the TRIPS agreement in the trade-related intellectual property rights agreement sometimes abused. And I think in Latin America, that's a big item, and has allowed it to steal traditional knowledge from particular indigenous communities. I will stop here, but with summarizing again that when we look, and we will increasingly look at this topic, Lamia, at the relationship between trade and indigenous people, I see these four axes of work, and we look forward to work more on this theme, and we look forward above all to learn, and this meeting for us is a part of this learning experience. Thank you very much for having us here.
Thank you so much, Marion. Now we are going to start the panel. We have three amazing speakers that I'm going to introduce, and I apologize in advance about the pronunciation. I really try already, but I'm sure I'm not going to be so bad. Tracy Haupapa is a co-chair of the Australian New Zealand Leaders Forum Indigenous Business Group, Aotearoa, New Zealand. Tracy is an award-winning company director and a recognized industry leader. She is a trusted advisor to Maori government, and she's named among the most influential women in New Zealand agribusiness and among the BBC's 100 most influential women in the world. You were talking about women, influential women. I mean, here we have an amazing panelist with us, and she's a member of the New Zealand Order of Merit for Services to Business and Maori, a Justice of the Peace and a Marriage Celebrant. We have with us as well Nikora Nyaropo, founder and director of Nikora Nyaropo Motion and Design. This is a motion and design company. Aotearoa, New Zealand. Nikora is a Maori entrepreneur and founder of his own company, director of Toro Studios. Nera is a member of the Digital Council for Aotearoa and the first Maori inducted into Asia Society 21 Young Leaders Forum. He's passionate about creating systemic change through education, technology, business, and culture. And last but not least, we're going to hear from Sean Armistead, Executive Director, Government and Public Relations, Indigenous Business Australia. In his current role, he has managed and delivered nationally award-winning programs impacting communities throughout Australia in collaboration with federal and state governments, resulting in the employment of more than 100 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people and tens of millions of dollars procured through Indigenous business. So I hope it was not so bad. And there is also a combination of French accent with the difficulty to pronounce some of the names. So I apologize for that. We are very excited to have you with us. We will ask you 2 rounds of questions, and I'm going to ask each of you to take 3 minutes to respond to this question. The first question I would like to address to you all is the following. What makes Indigenous exporters unique? What are the particular challenges and opportunities of Indigenous trade? These are very simple questions, but these are very important questions for us to help frame the debate. So I will start with Tracy Haupapa. Please take your 3 minutes and tell us about your key features and challenges.
Kia ora, Lamia. Kia ora tātou katoa. So acknowledging each and every one of you in the Indigenous language of Aotearoa. I'm absolutely delighted to be here this evening in New Zealand and today in your own countries. For me, when I thought about this question, I was very clear that from a Māori perspective, Indigenous exporters in many ways were described by Marian's opening comments. We think about a systems approach in the exchange of goods and services. We consider how people and place, or our people, interrelate with the environment. And as landowners, land users, and land managers, we as Māori consider goods and services that may be tradable domestically or on the international market. Our focus is always quadruple bottom line. So we all understand, and I'm sure this conversation, the triple bottom line, but for us, we think about our people and we think about an intergenerational viewpoint where we are aiming for the far horizon, being 100 years or more. So we think about our grandchildren's grandchildren, and our return may well be an investment, or our return on investment might well be financial. It may be a profit line. It may be thinking about how our enterprises, our businesses, which may be smaller, micro and small, medium-sized enterprises, to very large commercial and sophisticated enterprises. How we put back to the land, so measurable would be environmental benefits for our communities and regions. Measurable for one of the agribusinesses that I lead is how do we improve the quality of the water in our particular part of the region. So the feedback or the business framework and our experience and our expectations of how our businesses might add value to our shareholders, which are largely our people and our communities, as well as into making a very strong presence in international markets. Finally, what are the challenges and opportunities for Indigenous trade? Very quickly, some of those around access to capital. Some of those are about how Indigenous owned and led enterprises, whether they are land-based or otherwise, engage with financial institutions, banking systems, and how the policies and procedures or the financial instruments and conditions or criteria by which Indigenous peoples might access funding, finance, loans and investment support might intentionally or unintentionally prohibit Indigenous participation or access of such finance and capital. Lastly, the comment with regards to trade and gender rings true for me, of course, and I'm always going to say that the best possible return on investment in Indigenous is our women and our families. Nothing else from me, Lamia. I pass it back to you with gratitude and respect.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Now let's hear from Nicola Nyaropo, please.
Ka nui te mihi ki a koutou I whakakau mai nei ki tēnei kaupapa. So just acknowledging everybody here this morning in the room and abroad. Ko ai ahau, ko Nicola Nyaropo ahau he uri ahau no te raro tūhoi Ngāti Porou me Ngāti Kahungunu. So I hail from the far north here in New Zealand, from the tribes of Ngāpuhi and Te Rarawa, and then also from the east coast and central North Island, so Tūhoi, Ngāpuhi, Ngāti Porou and Ngāti Kahungunu. So kia ora mai tātou. I firstly want to talk about what makes Indigenous exporters unique, and then what are the challenges been. So for me personally, I'll talk firstly about the challenges. So historically, Indigenous peoples have not usually been at the table with a lot of these conversations, and we've been very lucky in the last year or so, especially with our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister Nanaia Mahuta, who spearheaded a lot of these processes and conversations in the space. So as part of that, there has been a movement of being able to push Indigenous culture to the forefront of some of these conversations and looking at how relationships are formed, firstly on a culture to culture basis, rather than just looking at the business. And so part of what I'm going to talk tonight about is around those relationships, around how we do business as Māori at a family level, at a wider family level, and then at an international global level, and then how that works with our partnerships abroad, whether that's across ASEAN or in North America, and also the evolution of what's happened over the last 2 decades of Māori making cultural roads in commerce and with nations that have a strong resonance with those cultures as well. So Southeast Asia, China, the Pacific Islands, Australia, South and Central America, North America, Canada, Norway, Finland, and Africa. So kia ora mai tātou.
Thank you so much. Now let's have Sean Armstead with us. Are you online?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Director. And I'd obviously also like to start by acknowledging country, acknowledging the land that I'm on here, south of Melbourne, the land of the Bunurong people, and paying my respects to elders from the past, from today, and from tomorrow, and also acknowledging traditional and First Nations people from all of the OECD, and also those that are present here. It's really, really interesting to have these sorts of conversations, and whilst I dislike following Tracy and Nicola, it's also great to be able to sit here and say, well, yep, that's a point. I agree with that, and absolutely I agree with that. What I would say is that one of the things that when we look at that question about being unique, and Director, your comments early on, which is, we look at First Nations people. Exporting is nothing new to First Nations people. I mean, it's something human species have done globally, but particularly with First Nations people. We look at the Australian context, and Aboriginal people traded more than a century before the first arrivals, the British, with the Makassar people of Sulawesi, which is now Indonesia. So there's always been that international trade, but also that inter-nation trade within Australia, and so that has been key. But through colonization, you get those barriers and some of those key points that you already talked about and you covered off. And I had my notes, which which basically read, excluded institutionally, excluded socially, and excluded financially. And they were the barriers that have been put up. Now, what we tend to see is in the last, in the Australian context, because I love looking across to New Zealand and seeing the leadership and the innovation that's being done there. And then we look to the US and Canada, for example, for some of the policies that came into play many decades ago, but have really now only just came in and have had an incredible impact for us. But without getting too far into that, when we come back to the question, what makes us unique? What Nikora said was really, for me, resonated, which was, it is about family and community. That's got to be key. Our relationships, the way we export and do business, is not transactionally. It is always about relationships. It is always about how can I impact community. One of the questions you get as an Indigenous business, both domestically, but as we now evolve and mature into international markets, is I've lost count of the number of the times people have asked me, what do you do within community, or what is your social impact? But it's almost worked into our DNA of how we do business. So I sort of think about the concept of uniqueness being how we treat our country, how we support and focus on our community and our families into our business and success, that we go beyond only transactional, and it can't be purely financial for us. And we also embrace our culture. We know that is a unique point of difference for us. So when we look at it, some people might think of it as just art and culture, but it is fashion, cosmetics, it's bush foods, it's native foods. And the director mentioned, the ambassador mentioned, the GIs, and I know that the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade have spoken to communities, and that's actually one of the things that I think the OECD can really take up, is that GIs, as we know, isn't as simple as saying, well, Kakadu plum comes from Northern Australia, and therefore that naturally that's a GI. There's a whole different aspects that go into it, but certainly having those unique native aspects to what we deliver economically is key. We also have what we call the Indigenous estate here in Australia. So great areas of land that are open. And so they're not only open for our domestic markets, but also foreign direct investment. So we have key people, even one on the call in the meeting right now, Darren Godwell, who heads up Ignite and has delivered a lot of this sort of innovative high-level thinking about what does the export market look like in the research. That's so very much key to us in what we do. So I'll take it back to community, family, the caring for country, connecting to country, and unlocking the Indigenous estate is what's unique for us.
Thank you so much. I think this is a very good transition to the second question. The OECD is a multidisciplinary organization. It's about data and policies. Our motto is better policies for better lives. So what we would like to hear from you, from the three panelists, is first, could you tell us if you have any specific policy or measures in your country that you think has made a difference, that has been very helpful to you to improve your trade condition as Indigenous exporters? And the second question, it's about the OECD. How can the OECD and OECD member countries help you? So again, we start with Tracy, please. We have Tracy.
Kia ora. They're both great questions, and we could probably spend the entire session on any one of them. Let me start with the examples of government policies and processes that are working here in Aotearoa. Our government today has a commitment to working with Māori as Indigenous people, as a partner to the Treaty of Waitangi, which was signed between Māori and the Crown government at that time. That treaty provides us with a partnership framework by which Indigenous and government work closely together to, a little bit like the directors just said, get better things done for better lives. The work that's being done right now is really looking at how government policies and policy reform might enable, support and resource Indigenous or Māori to take a better and stronger lead with regards to the use of natural resources and the management of natural resources, as well as how we might, I suppose, manage and use our land for better returns overall, from a cultural perspective as Indigenous, and from a business perspective as well, and also from a trader and an export perspective. The thing that is happening, well, the policies that the government is put in place right now means that government agencies and officials are more predisposed, or are increasingly predisposed to working with Māori to lead out on initiatives and programs for Māori. That's an important distinction, and it's a powerful premise for resourcing and supporting change and systems change, and Nikora as an expert in this area, in order for Māori to lead their own economic development and also to participate in the broader national economy as significant players, because our land, our agriculture, our primary industry has a significant footprint in the overall trading profile of the Aotearoa economy. The other thing that this government has done is made a really strong commitment to trade for all, which has a strong gender and ethnicity lens, which is important. And the other thing that I'm starting to see more of is an alignment of interagency resource capability, capacity, and strategy. Now, I know that sounds like a mouthful, but what that means is that the use of and application or delivery of funds, resources, support and opportunity from agencies to Indigenous is starting to become easier to access and more readily available. Are we there yet? No. Is there more to be done? Of course. And I think that the OECD and the member governments can start and do exactly what we're starting to do now. Have a better understanding and insight of Indigenous-led economies and what that means for Indigenous, of course, but also what that means for the overall national economy and then the global market and footprint that Indigenous might have. I think Sean and Nikora, just in summary, Sean and Nikora very nicely and very elegantly, of course, described how Indigenous are more likely to work with our own, and we are also more likely to collaborate and cooperate with other Indigenous economies and nations. And I think we touched a little bit before on IPECA, the Indigenous Peoples Trade and Cooperation Arrangement, which Australia, New Zealand, Canada and China's Taipei are a part of. And nothing else from me at this stage. Thank you very much, Director.
Thank you so much. Now let's turn to Nikora. Nikora, what type of policy measures has really helped being able to perform better on export markets, and how can the OECD help?
Absolutely. So I think one of the main things that I've seen over the last year or so, obviously there's the work that's been done in APEC, which has been mentioned, the IPECA, but there's also been other opportunities where our government here in New Zealand has really gotten behind Indigenous people and especially Māori. So Tracy spoke about the relationship part of that and how it is a dual relationship, and that's obviously spanned into so many areas across all sectors in Aotearoa. So when we are talking about where those policies sit, they sit within mahi tika, which is trust, mahi tahi, which is inclusion, mahi ake, which is growth, and then obviously measuring that success across all of the different sectors. So in Aotearoa, we've been lucky enough that Māori have a treaty which our government is working very closely with our Māori iwi chairs and with Māori groups. It's been the basis for how our people have started to really retain growth in assets and look towards that global value chain and how we can create larger wealth within our own communities and working with Indigenous peoples abroad. Now, one of the examples I have of that is Te Aratini. So that was the 4-day expo that was held over in Dubai as part of Dubai Expo for 2021 last year. Our government supported a group that headed over there. There are 45 entrepreneurs and business people, also government, that were working inside that group. And that was an Indigenous showcase from, I think, it was around 15 different countries who presented on stage during that time. But it was the main cope-up, or the main point of this was around Indigenous trade, business, how we could work better together. And so one of the examples I want to bring up is the Emirati. If we think about the Emirati as a people, they're Indigenous people, obviously in the United Arab Emirates, UAE, and over there they are only 14% of the population, but they control all of the assets. So in terms of how their GDP has grown over that time, it's gone from a $65 billion economy 25 years ago to $650 billion now. And so for me as an Indigenous male, it shows what can happen when there is capital, visionary leadership, and global connections in there as well. So I just wanted to leave that as an example of what can kind of happen when proper resources are in place for growth and wealth, and how that's included within their people. Obviously, the success is easily visible in terms of how their economy has grown and the different areas that they invest in, the capital that comes in on their borders and shores. And those are the types of things as Māori that we're looking to do here in Aotearoa. We also have the intergenerational models that we're working with. So if we think about models like Te Pai Tawhiti, that's a 500-year model and plan and strategy around growth, inclusion, and how our people, this particular model is for Te Waka too, which is down south, but how they are going to move in that direction and bring their people into the next 500 years. So I'll leave it there for a moment. Kia ora.
Thank you so much. Now let's turn to, I think we have an echo. Yes. Let's turn to Australia with Sean. Any particular government policy that have worked well for you, and how can the UCG create a better condition for you to thrive as an exporter?
Perfect. Thank you, Director. I've been very fortunate enough over the past, and it's now a decade, to see the impact of the Indigenous procurement policy that was instituted by the federal government. And it was one of these things that started in 2013, and it was a target of 3%. Without getting into the details, let's just call it 3% of government departmental spend to be with Indigenous owned businesses, as defined as 50% or 51%, etc. Over a period of a few years, what we saw was those targets were pushed down to the departmental level, and then they were put into the suppliers and the supply chain. So what you had was every department, from the Department of Defence to social services to education, etc., who had spend, had to find and work with Indigenous owned businesses and suppliers, which put an incredibly strong demand on Indigenous businesses, because people were trying to, on the supply side. So it went from federal government to the agencies to the suppliers, tier ones, large corporates. Then it went across, you saw it then go into the state levels. And then, for example, the state of Victoria, where I am, commenced with a 1% target. So they introduced it. Now, they wouldn't have introduced it unless the federal government had introduced it only a few years earlier. And then obviously a lot of the large corporates started putting it into their contracts. So if we look at some of the large resources companies, they had Indigenous land use agreements. They put in employment and procurement policies into it. So the Indigenous procurement policy has been one of the critical factors in stimulating and driving Indigenous business and enterprise in Australia, particularly domestically. And it's a policy that's not original to Australia. Like any good piece of policy, it's often borrowed and changed and tailored to the environment. So that was one of the key policies. And the fact that it sat within the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet was critical as well. It wasn't a policy that was just sitting in Indigenous Affairs with the Indigenous Affairs Minister. It sat within the remit of the Prime Minister. So there was that pressure that was put on the agencies to deliver. The second part was, and this is an organisation, but I'd still call it policy because it was funded, was Reconciliation Australia and what they call their Reconciliation Action Plans, RAPs. During the same time, they started to build up. So corporates loved them because they spoke the language of corporates, and they created these standardized action templates, which talked about relationships, respect, and opportunity. So those three areas. So every corporate, no matter how big or small, had these plans, and they, as I said, they spoke the language of the corporates, and they allowed people to hold those corporates accountable. So you had the IPP and the Reconciliation Action Plan. The third part, or policy or organisations that actually assisted at the same time, was Supply Nation, the rise of Supply Nation, which started a few years earlier, back in I think 2006 or 7, as AMSI, or the Australian Indigenous Minority Supply Council, that they then changed to Supply Nation or rebranded. That did a fantastic job of building membership and advocating for Indigenous businesses, and also more so corporates to be able to make their spend. And it's not just Supply Nation, which then featured in all government tenders. It was the Indigenous Chambers of Commerce, who were probably even better placed to be able to connect at the coalface with Indigenous businesses on the grounds in their regions. So you had those four elements that were working in tandem at the same time, that all sort of created this perfect storm of Indigenous business growth. Because I talk about the Indigenous business sector, you know, there's certain maturity levels. You know, we've sort of unlocked that domestic level, and there's still changes to go there, but now it's that international level. And so when we look at the international aspect, it is the players like the Export Council of Australia or the Department of Foreign Affairs with their Indigenous diplomacy agenda, promoting consulate generals into the US and to Canada through, you know, Indigenous consulate generals. The Indigenous or the Aboriginal First Nations ambassador, there was a commitment by our new Prime Minister in the lead up to the election, and his election is also another great signal about changing dialogue internationally. So the way I see it, they're the policies and organisations that created the impact, and the next level up, or the next, you know, opportunity being opened up, is that international stage. And that's why having foreign affairs and trade, that's why having people like, you know, advocates and sort of, you know, acknowledging Darren, having staunch exporting advocates like Darren Godwell and Ignite is key. It's key. It's one of those. It's part of the evolution of the community. As far as what the OEC can do, I might leave it to final remarks, but I do think it is around, nothing starts without this sort of dialogue. And as I said, those policies, that was just a policy that could have had some impact or negligible impact, really had an amazing impact. And it's because the right people sat in the room having the discussions of working out the right policy. So that OECD piece, bringing such enormous economies of scale to the table in support of Indigenous people, and saying, okay, how do we now address Indigenous business or First Nations business? It's key and critical.
Thank you so much, Sean, and we will continue to do so. Now we're going to start the Q&A session. And what we're going to do is that we're going to collect all the remarks here and online, and then we will ask the three panelists to respond one by one. And I'm going to start with the two ambassadors who are with us today, Ambassador of Canada, Ambassador of Colombia. They are going to make some remarks and ask you specific questions, starting with Ambassador Senette of Canada, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Now is it working? I was weak. I didn't push hard enough, right? But maybe it's because I'm so reflective about this great discussion we're having this morning. And I just want to acknowledge our speakers today who are so interesting, and that would lead to so many questions. But before, I just want to say thank you to New Zealand and Australia for this leadership at the OECD, and with the support of the OECD directorates here. It is so important to address the discussion on Indigenous community with the trade, but also with all the economic factor that implies that. And clearly what was said, 14 millions in 14 countries, that's a lot of people. And when we had the data that 5% of the world's population, but they are part of the 15% of the world's poorest, extreme poorest citizens, it is something to wake up. And that's why that in Canada, clearly we are working so hard in order to all the aspects that are related to Indigenous community, because we cannot afford to let that community on the bench. We need really to make them part of every aspect of our economic growth. But that being said, it's not always easy. And therefore the learning that we can have as a session today is so important. So as far as what was said, I just want to emphasize the challenge that was mentioned regarding access to finance. And this is the problem, as you were mentioning, Marian, in different subgroup, but there are, again, so many misperception of the Indigenous community and leadership, that a lot of work needs to be done into the financial system, but also to bring all the awareness that how these communities are so important for our future. And therefore, that dimensions of being local and to go to international. I'm always appreciative of the Indigenous community leaders, because you have so much on your shoulder. Like, it's kind of, you need to do it all again, kind of show and explain it all, but also have the network and reinforce your leadership locally, because locally we need to have that. And at the same time, how to connect internationally, because growth is with growth internationally. So that's a lot. So of course, in Canada, with the leadership of what Carolyn was mentioning on the Indigenous People Economic and Trade Cooperation Arrangement is very important, in the free trade agreements, where we emphasize in Canada the importance and how we take the Indigenous community into account are important. I just want to also emphasize what we have achieved at OECD last week with the agriculture ministerial. So for the first time, we were referring, to your point, Marian, to the Indigenous community, and we need to see that more and more, okay, in order to reinforce and to support the leadership of the Indigenous community. So questions, I had so many, but I would put two on the table for you. One thing that was mentioned by the last speaker is dialogue. But the other thing we have learned through the research is, in order to have the good dialogue, we need to have good data on the table. And that is an issue in order to get those data to inform better policy. So if, to the panelists, if you were to, in order to identify what are, in your point of view, the most important data that OECD need to focus in order to get that collectively, in order to support, what would that be in your point of view? And the second thing, which is about your leadership, okay, since you have so much on your shoulder to make it happen, how can we ensure that the leadership of the Indigenous community, not only about the leaders, but every members of your communities can be seen, like how to find the simple sentence to explain why Indigenous community needs to be at the table and needs to thrive, and we need to put all this energy, because there are so many other things that the citizens are bombarded with information. for the government to support the indigenous community and to help them to be at the table and to be part of the table, we need also to have the support of all the citizens within communities who have indigenous communities, but with countries as OECD, like we said 14, but there are 24 others that doesn't have indigenous communities. So we need to have that simple sentence that allow us to kind of say, you need to take them into consideration and have them included in all our declarations. So what would be that simple sentence that we need to always say around to convince them to engage the indigenous community at the table? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I'm going to turn now to the Ambassador of Colombia, Ambassador Medina, but meanwhile, I would like to ask all participants, should you have any who are online, should you have any question, please raise your hand on the screen. Ambassador Medina, please.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Lamia. It's been a great pleasure to be here and a very instructive opportunity for me, because I mean, the questions of indigenous peoples have been very important in Colombia over the past years. In 1991, we wrote a new constitution that for the first time recognized the presence and the rights and the importance and the prominence of indigenous peoples. And it's been a long and rocky road ever since. And I think that progress has been there, but staggering. And sometimes we have some mishaps and missteps and so on. So the question in my mind, whenever it comes to indigenous peoples, is probably shaped by the case of Colombia, is a question of governance. And I think there's one thing that I don't think we have gotten fully right in Colombia. We have acknowledged formally the rights of indigenous peoples, but then as a result, we have created an institutional structure of spokespeople of the indigenous peoples that interface with the government and with the state and enterprises and so on. But then my concern is that the state, government, and different enterprises, MNCs, and so on, they start like picking their favorites and co-opting and sometimes even corrupting some of these channels of communication so as to get the deals that they actually want. And in the process, I think that disfigures the nature of the goals of the indigenous people, that they want to safeguard their communities and their economies in their own terms. So, and I think we've seen that in the case of Colombia with mining, with water, with access to land, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, I think this session was very hopeful, because I think that trade is probably less vulnerable to these problems, because trade happens kind of more in their own terms. Okay? But if there is one thing I would want to learn from the speakers and the panel, is how to enhance the internal governance of the indigenous people so that they can act more robustly and they can speak with their, they can voice their own needs as communities without having this dynamics of the external actors trying to, you know, divide and conquer, trying to co-opt, and sometimes, like I said, even corrupt, so that they can present a unified voice. So how do we preserve their own governance structures as the dialogue progresses? That's kind of my main concern. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's have a look if we have any questions. Yes, sorry. Let's have a look if we have any question from participants. Should you have any, please raise your hand. Help me with the technology. Yes, we have also participants in the room. Can you please introduce yourself and raise your question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Guillermo Martinez de Velasco from the Mexican delegation. And just to share with all of you some reflections. Some months ago, in a meeting kindly hosted by Ambassador Jeanette, we raised the point that we need to realize that among our indigenous communities, there are huge difference in size and in many things. And for example, in agriculture, talking about that, in some of our countries, the production is mainly for auto consumption. So they will not have any opportunities to produce anymore to export in this case. In some cases now we have some cooperatives that are helping some communities to join efforts and do some small exports. But I would like to share something that is now funny to you. Some years ago, a large department store in the United States organized a Mexico week, so you can find everything from Mexico, and among the products were some handcraft from indigenous communities. And then this store came and said, great, I like 1 million pieces. It was impossible to produce, obviously. So we need to realize that that sizes, even for export purposes, because they don't have the volume by themselves to do some export, or the export will be very expensive. So they need to gather together, they need to promote more integration among communities in order to at least raise that point. And that brings me to an OECD 2019 meeting that it was very interesting, because the Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, Sami people brought the idea to create a common market among indigenous people, because then the indigenous from Colombia and Mexico can export the coffee directly to the indigenous of other countries. And among them, it's easier to get some involvement and better conditions and better understanding than if they go to the traditional market. And finally, I believe really that OECD can be the promoter of guidelines to try to integrate these communities into common better practices. And if we review that 2019 conclusions, I think there is a lot on that meeting that we can take it now and try to bring it to a reality. Thank you.
Thank you. There is any other question? Okay, great. So now what we're going to do, we're going to hear from you, the three panelists. Just I would like to recall, there was one question about data. Which data are crucial in need to advance the trade agenda for you? There was a question about the keywords for a nice pitch to convince the society that indigenous people should be at the table. There was also some reflection about how to better organize the different indigenous groups so that we will have this a system of governance that works. And I understand very well your question, Ambassador, because we had your minister in our rural conference who explained to us the difficulties that you are facing, having the different indigenous groups that actually are not getting along. And I'm sure that it's happening in many other countries. So how to organize this system of governance across different indigenous groups. And there was not any question from Mexico, but I see one behind, which is, does a common market for indigenous populations between New Zealand and Australia could work as well? So let me now start with the participants. So let's start with Tracy first. Yes. Tracy.
Kia ora, Director. So would you like me to answer all three questions or just the first?
You can answer the one you like.
Oh, wonderful. I like them all. And I think I'll answer probably the one around the data and the one around how do we engage in this way. For as many Indigenous people as there are on this planet, there are different approaches for each of us. And so what might work for us as Māori in New Zealand will be quite different for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island countries and leaders. And for us, that difference in diversity is a strength. It's also a framework by which we might readily engage. And while that might seem complex to people who are not Indigenous or familiar with those relationships, that is a superhighway by which we might trade and exchange. We have done that over millennia, and we will continue to do so. The question around data for me is very much around and it goes back to the why. And I'd start with that first, if I might, Ambassador. That is that for Māori, we are a sovereign nation. We are recognised as a sovereign nation. We are recognised for our contribution to the overall economic success of Aotearoa, as well as having very strong and long responsibilities and obligations to deliver for our own people. How do we craft that into a bit of a pitch or a slogan? For us in Aotearoa, it is about what's right, doing what's right, and recognising that Indigenous have deep connections to the land, that the Treaty of Waitangi in our case is that connector, and it provides a framework for partnership by which we might explore opportunities. I don't think that there is a single data set that might assist. I do think that recognising the sovereignty of Indigenous, our contribution to the overall economic success of nations, domestically and internationally, is important. I want to finally touch on the common market approach because I absolutely love that. And I love the fact that it is a platform, be that virtual or global, a platform by which Indigenous peoples might meet and exchange. And would there be a framework for that? Only in as much as there might be a place where we might do so. And what might be the economy for that, I think is a conversation that needs to be had soon after this meeting. Nothing else from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Let's hear now from Nikora, please, to answer to some of these questions.
I'll start with the data question. So what data is crucial to advance Indigenous interests? For me personally, I come from an education background, and so creating a digital baseline and a stock take of the skills that are prevalent across a community is a big one. Once you know what you have there, you can look at the areas where you need to be looking forward, and then how you can connect that expertise into a global value chain. So in terms of the data, I think that it is, it's imperative to get a grip on what is currently happening at a grassroots level and what needs to improve. And then on the back end of that, the conversation is around where do we want to be going, or if I'm speaking about Māori, where do we want to be in the next 10, 15, 500 years? And so for a lot of our people here in Aotearoa, we are looking at what are the skills that we currently have and what do we need. If we are looking at the trade and export markets that are currently available, those opportunities are opening and closing all the time. And the entry level into those is also changing as well. So when I look at that, I also look at, for instance, the jobs that are available now that weren't currently in existence 10 or 15 years ago. Those have happened in a very short space of time. And so I also look at what are we going to be seeing within the next 5, 10, 15 years as well? How will those markets change? What opportunities will come about? And where do we as Indigenous people need to upskill to be able to take advantage of those? So that's one area. The governance question was the other one that I was going to look at. For me, and just thinking about Māori, there is a definite shift in terms of the way we are looking at our governance. And you have historical models which have been in existence for a very long time. What we are seeing now as Māori, Māori taking those concepts but shaping them around cultural values and adding a very strong cultural lens to the way that they are built up from the ground. So the foundations of those governance structures are now changing. And by that, I mean, one of the organizations I'm involved with, for example, is Te Matarau, which is the Māori Teka Association. Our foundational principle for that has values around hononga, which is connection. And that's not just connection to people or relationships, that's also a connection to time, place, and space. And what I mean by that is that we do look at that intergenerational model, how we are looking forward. We are looking at the locations of our people. But when we're talking about spaces, we are also talking about our ability as Māori to move and connect with each other, not just in a physical sense or in a virtual sense, but in a spiritual sense as well. So there are values within that. On the other side of that, we also look at whakapapa. So that's your genealogy, making sure that you have firm foundations in terms of knowing who you are, where you're from, where your connections, whether your blood connections or relationship connections, where those are strong, where they're weak, and where they need to be nurtured as well. So that also looks at what is happening abroad and overseas and how we connect. So for me as a Māori male, one of the first things that I do when I'm looking at that governance structure and then our strategic direction of how we plug into international trade and enterprises, where do the values of those companies sit with my Indigenous Māori values? Do they align? Will we work well together? Can we see that relationship growing? Because the other side of that is what I'm looking for is I'm looking for a partnership on equal terms that will grow together and flourish together, not one which is heavily weighted on one side and where there aren't benefits flowing up and down in both directions. So I just thought I'd mention that. That's all from me. Kia ora.
Thank you so much. Sean, please.
Thank you, Director. Look, I might just talk about the governance and voice. I think the Ambassador of Colombia mentioned, and finding that unity as such. And look, in the Australian context, there are more than 400 Aboriginal tribes, groups, etc. So you're never going to have unity, right? There's a saying we say, look, you have 3 Aboriginal people in a room, you'll have 5 different opinions. Right? It's one of the sort of the jokes. There's always a lot of dialogue and differences. But unity can be rare, but it's also been found, and for us it's found, I think, my personal opinion is in some of those bodies that are representative. So we have, for example, the Coalition of the Peaks. That's a national body that is able to present to the government and to the Parliament on all things health, predominantly health. The Indigenous chambers from all around the country have now met twice, and they're forming a national Indigenous body. And so again, that'll be able to give voice to an advocacy for Indigenous business and Indigenous business development, therefore economic development nationally. One of the things, just touching on some of the points that were made. So within the Australian context, we've never, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we've never had sovereignty. We've never had a treaty. I think we're one of the only Commonwealth countries that the government never made a treaty with. And so that's sort of gives us some context of our sort of journey where there's never been that truth telling. The current government is committed to a referendum on what we call the voice. So about 5 years ago, a lot of people, representatives from all over the country met in Alice Springs. Also, not at Alice Springs, at the foot, actually in Alice Springs in the center of the country. And they created this statement, and they called it the Statement from the Heart. And it identified, and it's actually a beautiful statement if anybody has the opportunity to read it, because it talks about, levels of incarceration, our history, etc. But what we really want as a people. And that statement from the heart, or that Uluru, the Statement from the Heart, has really became a cry for what we want next in our country. And so that's why the government have now said that they'll go to a national referendum. I think we're looking at next year for that. From that will be constitutional recognition, a Makarata, which is a truth-telling commission, and also a model to have or to address any aspects or any policy that has an impact on First Nations people within Australia. So that voice in that referendum, we're hoping will flow from next year. At a state level, some of our states have now entered the treaty process. So here in Victoria, they were the first government, the Victorian government, to start a treaty process with First Nations people here. So we're now only really starting to see that. So that's what I would say around the governance, voice and unity. I think you have to have either that constitutional recognition, which you do, but those bodies that come together that hopefully are large enough that they can create a unified voice.
Thank you so much. Now we are getting to the end of this event. And first of all, I would like to thank the three panelists. There are a lot of incredible takeaway for us. Of course, I would like to thank also New Zealand and Australia, the two ambassadors who have been organizing this event, hosting the event, the participation of the ambassador of Colombia and Canada. And now we are going to give the floor to the ambassador of Australia, Ambassador Pearson, who has the very tough task to give us concluding remarks and wrap up most of the important messages that we hear today from the participants.
Thank you, Lamia. And I think it's been, a terrific conversation. I'm not going to try and summarize it, although I will focus on sort of three things that I thought, and then it won't be comprehensive, but were particularly striking to me. One is the prominence that was given to the distinctive role that Indigenous people place on country, family, and community, and also at an intergenerational level. Now, and it struck me at the time, I think it was something that Tracy said, was that, and I hope I didn't get this wrong, but I'm not sure that our, whether it's our financial institutions, whether it's even some of our governments, recognise how that plays out. And, because we've got our own sort of capitalist model, which may not necessarily place as much value on country, family, and community relationships. And so we have to think through what that means and whether there needs to be an adjustment of how, whether it's in the way that financial institutions assess the conditions for access to finance, for example. So, but I think that it's much broader than that. And I think that was something that, we really have to ponder whether or not our systems are ready for that. And I think we've got to adjust them if they're not. The second bit was the collaboration story, because I think, and that goes across nations. I mean, I think the IPECTA is a terrific start at linking up policies and practices. I think this work is an important way of sharing amongst our different communities across the 14 economies in the OECD. And also, we had the common market idea. Sean mentioned how work was accelerating at a national level for collaboration between different Indigenous groups. And so I think that how we link best practice, common challenges together, I think is another important part. And finally, the policy bit. Now, there's a couple of different parts to the policy thing. I think there was some very good examples of how government policy is working. I think I think Sean mentioned the procurement work that in Australia, that, and I remember, because I was in the Australian mining industry at the time, and there was a discussion. I remember that a meeting at Parliament House where this was being launched. And the thing that really got the attention of government departments was that whether or not they reached the 3% target was a performance indicator for the heads of those departments. And that really made them sit up. And I think it's been an outstanding success. But I think we also heard about the importance of Indigenous diplomacy. I'm pleased that the Australian government is establishing a role as a First Nations ambassador, and part of that will be exploring how Indigenous exporters can succeed in and how we can help promote that enterprise. I mean, there are the promotional work that I think it was Nikora talked about at Dubai. That's an obvious one where I think we can, across different communities, benefit. And there's sort of also, and obviously the data gaps that are still to be filled. There are also some policy challenges, and I think that Marion talked about this. The provenance question. How do we guarantee provenance? Is it how do we ensure what institutional arrangements are necessary to give both the Indigenous communities and also the consumers who are desperately keen to ensure that whenever they buy something, they want to be supporting the real generators of that those unique products and services. Whether it's a GI thing, it's harder than GIs because it's not necessarily a geographical locational issue. But I think that's one that we also, I think there's some interesting work that could happen here and elsewhere on that issue. Traditional knowledge, I mean, it's been around for a long time, and I think it's really important. It's never been more important. But it's not easy, but I think we should also try and get the OECD to kick that along. So a lot of things in just 80 or so minutes. And so I really thank I want to thank Madeline from Canada, because in the last 9 months or so, she's added new energy to this discussion across a range of different areas on the Indigenous people's agenda. And so I want to thank Madeline for that. I want to thank Caroline and Lamia also, has been very much a part of that new energy. Caroline for her suggestion we do this, and which we were delighted to support, and to the speakers as well. And let's hope that there are more of these, because I think it was very illuminating and thrown up a number of different areas of further work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, now, thank you so much, everybody. As ambassador person, this is one event that should be part of a series that we will continue to organize with the objective that Ambassador Jeanette has put up front, that is, we have to mainstream the question of Indigenous in all the OECD activities. So we have started to do that on our side. Now we are in all our rural reviews. Now we are looking at this dimension. And by the way, we're going to launch the one of Colombia in 10 days. We are doing some work on innovation in Canada, where we look at the question of Indigenous people. We have a program of work on mining regions, and we will also address that. Thank you so much to Marion. We will continue to join forces and try to push together this agenda. But then, of course, we will continue the series we discussed last time. There are many other important topics that we will have to discuss among ourselves. And I'm thinking, for instance, about education. I know that our colleagues, they have been working a lot. It will be great that we focus also on the question of education, on well-being, on the question of the future of work and so on. So there are many interesting topics and many opportunities to engage with other directorates. Thank you so much for being with us, and don't hesitate to contact the OCD should you need any information or just to have a voice. We offer you the platform. Thank you so much.